Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you so much for having me here to share my passion. And my passion is nature. I am wild, just wild about nature. And when I say nature, I don't necessarily mean gardens, because there's a difference between gardening and nature. And when I got into gardening, I got into it because I thought I would be working with nature, only to find out that in many ways in gardens, we work against nature. So this all started for me when right out of college, I lived in Eastport on a farm that had been vacated for 40 years. And it was 50 acres of fields. And because native plant seeds can live ungerminated in the soil for up to 50 years, after this farm was vacated, it reverted back to nature. All the wild grasses and the native flowers all came back. So I was raised in an organic farm family, so I was predisposed to love nature. It's in my blood. So at this place, I was surrounded by not only the wildflowers and the wild grasses, but also all the native creatures that have co-evolved with the native plants. There were butterflies and turtles and salamanders and hawks and owls and deer and fox and groundhog and chipmunks and all the creatures who delight us so much. In front of the house and around the back, there was a small fence. And where most people would normally have a lawn, I just let everything grow in the same way that it was growing in all the fields around me. And I could look out every window and see butterflies and all different pollinators, and I was just in heaven there. I walked down the street for an artist in her studio, and I used to walk down the street to work, and the whole way was just all native grasses and native creatures. And I was not the kind of person who was going to go out with friends at night. I couldn't wait to get home, to be surrounded by nature. And when the moon shone, it shone on the back of the horses and in their frosty breath. And I was just in natural bliss in this environment. Eventually, the artist I was working for moved back to New York City, so I went to work in a garden center. And one day when I came home from work, surprise, surprise, somebody had mowed all the vegetation around my house, around the front and the back. And I went into mourning. I was so sad. I was missing all of the life that was teeming before it was mowed. And I asked all my neighbors who did it, and nobody would admit it. And that's very interesting, because they knew it was going to upset me. And yet they felt a social responsibility. They felt, it's even a law in New York State. You can't get a CO until you have your lawn in place. And I don't think it should be a law. I think if you don't want to have a lawn, you should be allowed not to have one. But my neighbors felt that I should have a lawn, and nobody would admit that they did it. So after a while, it grew back, and I was so thrilled, only to come home and find it mowed again. And nobody ever admitted it. So ingrained is this notion that we have to have lawns. So I was working at a garden center on the landscaping crew in gardens like these, but I didn't care at all for the lawns. I wanted to be in the wild parts. I wanted to be where the bugs were and the snakes and all the butterflies and all the pollinators. So I didn't care about lawn. I've never learned about how to do lawn care. I'm more interested in the other plants, the native plants that sustain life. One day I was weeding in a garden, and there were two very strong stalks. It turned out to be mare's tail, which is a native plant. And there was a beautiful spider web with a beautiful spider in it, and the spider web had dew on it. It was just incredible. But it was my job to pull that out, because it wasn't one of the plants that were purchased by the owner. So I pulled them out, and the spider went running away, and the plants that had been there were now wilting because the mare's tail was holding them up. And I started to wonder, what is all this undertaking when we're actually pulling out native plants and defining them as weeds. So that's when I realized that gardening and nature were a little bit in conflict with each other. And a lot of the plants that we were tending to were brought here from other places, and they needed pesticides and fertilizers and a lot of water in order to live here. I call that stuff life support in order to live here. So fast forward many years when I got my own house, the front had been bulldozed for construction, but the back was left completely natural, and I was thrilled. So the first thing I did was I put a privacy screen around the whole place because I wanted to see, knowing that native seeds can germinate, live in the soil and germinate for up to 50 years, I decided not to do anything with the front yard and just to see what came up. And I was so delighted. I started to have these moments like I had back on the farm, the vacant farm, and I started to have native plants come up. This is native primrose, Euthymia caroliniana, and in the back, the purple flower is Vernonia. These are plants that just came up. I didn't plant them, and they came up wherever they wanted to. This is Rosa virginiana, Verbena hostata, Eupatorium hispifolium, and asters. I had mosses, and I also had endangered plants. This is peace pipe. It's a chlorophyllous plant, and it's very rare and endangered. I had those in several spots. I also had a lot of Queen Anne's lace, which is not a native, but it's very important for pollinators, so I was happy to see that as well. I had blue-eyed grass, and one day, I was walking in the grass with a friend, very well-intentioned friend. He said, "You should just mow this twice a year." And just then, at the perfect moment, I stepped on something, and when I lifted up my foot to see what it was a turtle in my yard. Yay! So I said, I'm never, ever mowing this. In fact, I haven't used a lawnmower probably in 35 years. Because I'm associated with the Wildlife Rescue Center of the Hamptons, and because I've rescued at least 1,000 animals, and 95% of those animals were impacted by humans. I've rescued animals injured by lawnmowers, chainsaws, weed whackers, and pesticides. I could tell you some heart-wrenching stories about these poor little innocent creatures who were damaged by our landscaping undertakings. So I have so much wildlife. I have turtles, toads, squirrels, rabbits, and I came to realize after a while that my property was a sanctuary for all the neighborhood creatures, and I'm just delighted with that. I have possums. They're the cutest thing. I have so many birds that when I give my lecture at the Nature Lyceum, the director introduces me and he says, "If you don't have any birds in your yard, that's because they're all at her house." And I think it's true. I have thousands of birds. I'm so lucky. In fact, I was giving a lecture to the Audubon Society, and before they begin their meeting, they all get up and they talk about what rare birds they've seen. But somebody got up and she said, "Oh, I found a spot where there were whippoorwills." And she described the street, how to get to the street and where to sit and which mailbox. And I said, that's my house. So I'm thrilled to have all these creatures to share my life with. And I even have deer. I know deer are controversial, but I love deer. My Native American friends call me Deer Heart. Deer footprints are even in the shape of a heart. I have amazing insect life on my property, and I'm as much a fan of insects as I am of birds. Love them all. They're like jewelry flying around. Vortexes catching light like little stars. So I was just starting to enjoy my property, feeling all this life, the vibration of life, and someone handed me, this is a long time ago, an article that said in the town of Southampton, everybody had to have a lawn that was mowed. I think it said 1.5 to 2 inches. Every tree had to be trimmed, every shrub had to be trimmed. trimmed. And so I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be a criminal if this law is passed. And yet I knew that what I was doing was right for the earth and for all of creation. So I decided to go to the town and give them a presentation. But before I did a lot of research. And there was so much research online to support what I was experiencing and the way I was living. And a lot of the research was about that nature is good for us. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? Nature is good for us, imagine that. It's good for us spiritually. A presence other than our everyday self is inherent in all wild spaces. It connects us to a vast reservoir of energy and meaning to which our own life is given significance. Nature is good for us physically. Just a few minutes with trees or in any natural space improves concentration, problem solving, reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, and decreases muscle tension. Nature is good for us mentally. Inner city residents with nature nearby have significantly lower levels of aggression and violence, and workers in buildings with plant life concentrate better and have less anxiety. Employees with window views of nature have lower levels of job stress and higher reports of general well-being. Prisoners have less conflicts when they're allowed to spend time in a natural space. Engaging with the natural world has restorative calming effects, whereas living in a world of asphalt, concrete, and steel heightens stress and anxiety. Nature is good for us medically. Breast cancer patients recover faster and better when they spend half an hour a day listening to and watching birds or strolling through a park. Patients who underwent bronchoscopy reported experienced less pain and needed less pain medication if they were allowed to view nature or even listen to a recording of a babbling brook. A 9-year study of gallbladder patients in the United States found that patients recovered faster and required less pain medication if their hospital windows overlooked nature as opposed to a brick wall. Wilderness therapy is being offered to cancer patients, emotionally disturbed children, and even rape survivors. Doctors and researchers then found that even looking at a picture of nature can have some of the same effects. So another thing I found when I was doing research was this book, Last Child in the Woods. It had just come out then. Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Isn't that a great term? Nature Deficit Disorder. And I think that's a real phenomenon. We as human beings need nature, of course we do. And part of the sadness of losing all of our natural surroundings is that we have an innate yearning for it. And once it's gone, we're still going to have the yearning because we've evolved with it, and we're not even going to know what we're missing. We're just going to have that unfulfilled yearning for nature. So nature is good for children. That book says it, and there's a lot of other research too. Children as young as 5 show a significant reduction in the symptoms of ADD when they engage with nature. Environment-based education develops skills in problem solving, critical thinking, and decision making. Children who play in natural settings are more cooperative and more likely to create their own games than those who play on flat turf. At-risk youth who are given time outdoors as part of their curriculum improve their test scores across the board in every subject. They behave better in class. They establish positive relationships with their peers, and they gain respect for themselves and for the environment. Nature is a potent therapy for depression. One of the children that I was just talking about wrote a journal, and he wrote, "For the past few months, I found myself unmotivated. I almost felt a disconnection from myself because I couldn't take the time to think. When I sat down in nature this weekend, I found myself connected, my insides and my outsides." Nature is so beautiful. It's our healer, our love, our beauty, and we're part of it, of course. So I love this. Researchers compared, since they knew nature was good for us, they compared different natural settings. A lawn as opposed to a forest and a garden, a lot of different settings. The lawn had the least benefits, the forest had the most. The more biodiversity there is in any given section, the more health benefits are achieved. So biodiversity increases all health benefits. And this was on the cover of the Sierra Atlantic. Managing stress, try trees. It says, take a walk in the woods, find a street with some trees and walk there. That's all good, but why do we have to go somewhere? Why can't we, out every window of our own house, see nature? Why can't we just step out any door of our own house and have nature all around us? Why do we have to drive or walk? Why can't we just live with nature? And yet, this is what we do when we buy a property. The first thing, kill everything on it. This made me so sad. I actually had tears in my eyes when I saw this. I wanted to know, where were the birds? Where were the turtles? Where were the chipmunks and fox and everything? This was about a 5-acre piece of land. Just so sad, such a loss. And then we do this. And then we call it improved, but I call it spoiled. So what happens to animals when the land is cleared this way? They're displaced, their food is taken away, their shelter is taken away, and they're territorial. You might look at this and say, well, they can just go off into the woods there, but any amount of land can only hold a certain number of wildlife. There isn't, this can hold all the wildlife, this wooded section beyond here. Hibernating animals have no way to escape. Baby birds have no way to escape, whereas mammals can take their babies in their mouth and carry them away. Birds can't do that, and birds are protected, and yet we have this destruction of their habitat year-round, even when there are babies in the trees. And the continuum of native habitat is disrupted and fragmented into ever smaller, unconnected pieces. Migratory routes are disrupted. This is a deer that we rescued out of the same spot in the same fence twice in 1 week, because that was his migratory route. And that was all of a sudden gone, and they were still taking that route, and he didn't understand that there was a fence there because of the way deer see. But so migratory routes are disrupted. So facts about wildlife. We're losing wildlife at a rate 1,000 times the rate of natural selection. We're losing 150 to 200 species a day. And extinction hasn't happened that fast since the dinosaurs went extinct. We're actually in a mass extinction. Long Island, we've killed more than half the wildlife in the last 50 years. And the United Nations Environmental Program estimates that half of the world's species are on the brink of extinction, and because of this, we lose one major drug every 2 years. That needs no explanation. Nor does this. So this was a map that the Nature Conservancy put together, and it designates global forest lost. In the last 300 years, global forest has shrunk by half. And from the year 2000 to 2005, the country with the top percentage of forest loss was the United States. Not the Amazon, not Brazil, the United States. And look where it is. Us. Everywhere I go, I see 80 acres for sale, 60 acres for sale, 40 acres for sale, even 4 acres or 1 acre for sale. It's all deforestation. And why should we care about deforestation? Soil, the trees, the roots of the trees hold our island together. And when we scrape that all off, the trees, the shrubs, the herbaceous plants, all the roots go with it, and we have soil runoff. Soil runoff gets into our waterways. It covers fish eggs so they can't hatch. It gets into the gills of fish and makes them sick. It covers plants in the water so they can't photosynthesize. The more trees and shrubs you have on your property, the slower the water drips, the slower the rainwater drips. So you don't have this water slaloming across the landscape. It has a chance to soak into the soil. And it shades the soil, water doesn't evaporate as quickly, roots take in more water, and the trees hold the soil in place. This gentleman in the yellow shirt is my friend, Dr. Jim Conroy. He's the tree whisperer. He goes all over the world solving problems with trees that nobody else can solve by communicating with plants. And this is a picture in my yard where he was giving a lecture teaching everybody how to communicate with plants. So whether you buy that or not, that's another reason to care about destroying all the trees. And somebody took this picture of me while I was communicating with one of my trees. So why should we care about all of this? Because all life on Earth is interdependent. Squirrels, you see them burying the acorns in the fall, and they only recover 10% of those. The rest germinate and become oak trees. So we have the squirrels to thank for keeping our island together by planting oak trees for us. There used to be a wasp. We killed it when we sprayed DDT, but it used to parasitize the tick nymph. Too bad we don't have them anymore. If we hadn't sprayed DDT, we would have a ready-made solution for our tick problem. But also spiders eat ticks, and there are funguses and nematodes that feed on ticks. And moles, I know everybody loves to hate moles, but they do carry beneficial funguses from plant to plant. I love this one about the western fence lizards. They're cleansed of the when ticks bite western fence lizards, they're cleansed of that bacteria responsible for causing Lyme disease. Now that's out west, but it's just a perfect illustration of how nature has its own system of checks and balances. And when we undertake all this destruction in nature, who knows what we're doing to ourselves in the process. A recent UN commissioned report concluded that people have changed ecosystems more profoundly in the past 50 years than at any previous time. And because of that, 60% of the life-supporting functions of the Earth are in decline. That's scary. And I realize I'm giving you a lot of scary stuff, but in the end, there's hope. This is native cinnamon fern, and this is more about the interconnectedness of things. The hummingbird actually takes the cinnamon from this fern and lines their nest with it to keep mites out of the nest. This white flower here is a native Achillea, and this attracts bugs that will eat the bugs that are attacking your cucurbits. So if you have this in your garden, your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your melons will all be a lot safer. This is one of my favorite plants, native primrose. And this is a plant that I pulled out by the thousands when I was working with the garden crew because it was considered a weed. But the flowers provide nectar for so many pollinators. It's always buzzing. Leaves are eaten by almost all the mammals on Long Island. And then they have very strong, sturdy stalks, and they hold thousands of seeds, and the birds eat the seeds all winter. It's an extremely useful plant. Species loss increases disease in humans. New York research has found that when species are lost from habitats and others survive, it is the survivors that are more prone to disease. Biodiversity loss tends to increase pathogen transmission among the surviving species, while biodiversity has a protective effect. In forested areas that lose our buddy the opossums, white-footed mice increase, and so do populations of ticks that carry Lyme disease. So biodiversity keeps us healthy. And all the animals don't have to have a direct purpose for us. They're here because they're born here, they're born on Earth, they love being here on Earth, they want to raise their young, and they're delightful. I love animals. And yet, this is what we do. I want to have a float for the Wildlife Rescue Center with a forest and a for sale sign on it and all the little creatures in the woods, because this is where they live, and this is what we do. And then we do this. We create monocultures where one thing is allowed to live at the expense of everything else. Lawns are the major contributor to habitat fragmentation and the continuing loss of habitat both locally and globally. Every time we install a lawn, we cut away at our very own ecostructure. We force lawns into ecosystems where they don't belong, and then we use chemicals and vast time and energy resources to suppress the natural forest underneath, all the while mowing down edible and medicinal plants and plants that are useful to humans and other creatures alike. So pesticides. First type of pesticide is herbicide. A weed is a plant that's growing where we don't want it. So when you have a lawn, everything but the blades of grass are a weed. People used to have a variety of plants in their lawns for salads and medicine and teas, but that has changed drastically. And I have 3 books that I use to illustrate my feeling about weeds. This one, Identifying and Harvesting Edible and Medicinal Plants, will tell you how you can use it as medicine, how you can eat it, how you can use the fibers, hundreds of ways to use plants. This book, Weeds in My Garden, Observation of Misunderstood Plants, will tell you what wildlife depends on the plant, how the plant can make the soil more fertile, clean the air. And then you have this book, produced by a chemical company. It's the same exact plants, but this book is going to tell you what chemical to use to kill the plants. And I looked through this book, and about 50% of the plants in this book are native plants, and we're designating them as weeds, useful, bad plants, so that we can have our lawn. And one of the plants in that book is milkweed. Milkweed is native, and there are a lot of varieties of milkweed. And I've been wondering where all the monarchs went. This year, I saw 7 monarchs. So sad that I could count them, how many monarchs I saw this year, when they used to be everywhere. Well, I did some research. I Googled where did all the monarchs go, and all the research suggests that they're gone because there's no more milkweed. They're 100% dependent on milkweed. So a lot of farmers are spraying pesticides to kill milkweed. So wherever you can, plant milkweed, Asclepias. This is another native plant that I love it. It's Phytolacca americana, or pokeweed. It's a native plant that's edible to humans before it's 6 inches high. Lots of mammals eat the leaves, including deer. I have this on my property for them to eat, and they don't eat much else. It's gorgeous. I'm just fascinated by it. And it has these plump berries that the birds eat. In my yard, they get about 8 foot high. They're so stately and gorgeous. I let them grow wherever and all my clients' properties have these too. And again, this is another plant that I used to pull out by the thousands because I thought it was a weed. This is Pennsylvania smartweed. I love this so much that it's a ground cover all over in my yard, and it is even seeded in the bases of my tropicals. And it's beautiful there. It's no maintenance, and birds love to eat the seeds. And this is a real interesting one, clover. It's not a native, but it was introduced to America in grass seed mixture because it fixes nitrogen in the soil. And then when 2,4-D was invented and they started to use it to kill crabgrass, they found out that it killed the clover also. So they just rebranded this plant as a weed. Now everybody thinks it's a weed. It worked. But this plant has nitrogen-fixing properties in the soil, and it's very beneficial to wildlife, especially bees. And we really have to do whatever we can for the bees. So if you see this plant, try to nurture it. Dandelions are also beneficial to bees and other pollinators. And they make our ground more fertile because that long taproot that goes into the ground brings a whole bunch of fertility up into the leaves. And then when the leaves die back, that fertility goes back into the soil. So insecticides. Our war against insects has had intended and significant casualties. So many of our beneficial insects are killed by insecticides. And most insecticides are not species specific. Those are just some of the beneficial insects that are killed by insecticides. So I have a beneficial insect garden. This used to be my vegetable garden, and you can still see some in the foreground is horseradish, and there's borage and cilantro, and there's even some kale that you can see. But one year I didn't have time for it, and all of this stuff came up. And when I was walking through it, I was surrounded by insects dancing all around me. It was such a great, powerful vibration. And this is when I started to really fall in love with insects. And the thing is, I never get bitten by any insects. I really don't. I have less ticks on my property than most other places I go to. I rarely ever get bit by a mosquito. I'm not saying I never do, but I hardly ever do. And only 15% of the insects on Earth are detrimental to us. That means 85% of the insects are beneficial to us. The National Wildlife Federation estimated that insects perform every year, free of charge, $57 billion worth of services that are useful to us. And insects are a source of food for birds, turtles, fox, hawks, owls, snakes, toads. If I ever do have an insect infestation, you can see this catalog is 2009, so I haven't had a problem with insects since 2009. But this is what I call the Green Methods catalog, and they have very easily in the front, in the table of contacts, you can look up if you have ants or aphids, or they'll sell you the bug to eat whatever problem, whatever insect is giving you a problem. And it's non-chemical, and it works. This is in my yard. That's a tomato hornworm that was parasitized by a trichogramma wasp. And what I love about this is that I didn't buy that trichogramma wasp. That was in my yard because I'm not spraying pesticides. So nature took care of the problem for me. So fungicides. I love this story. I gave a lecture right at the rescue center once, and I'm fascinated by fungus. So I took this picture before I started my lecture. And then I got to the part of my lecture where I was talking about how funguses are an important food source for wildlife, and somebody was like, oh, look at that, look at that. And right behind me, as I got to this part, a squirrel harvested this mushroom, ran off with it, and ate it about 10 feet away. So, and they're cool. I'm fascinated by the variety of fungus, and their purpose in the environment is to break down wood and make the nutrients in the wood available for the host plant or for other plants to use. They also break down toxins. There's a man called Paul Stamets who's using funguses to clean up the nuclear waste at the Chernobyl site. He's using fungus to clean up the nerve gas that Saddam Hussein used on the Kurds. And he's using funguses to clean up oil spills. His name is Paul Stamets. It's fascinating. He wrote a book called How Fungus Can Save the World. And if you watch him for 5 minutes on YouTube, you're hooked. You believe it's amazing. But indeed, plant life couldn't survive without fungus. There's a mycelial network under the soil that sends nutrients and information from one plant to another. There were some researchers that saw a stand of hemlocks on the edge of a forest, and then very deep in the forest where there was no light at all, there were hemlocks there too, and they couldn't figure out how the hemlocks deep in the forest were even surviving. And they discovered that the hemlocks on the edge of the forest were actually sending nutrients through the mycelial network to the hemlocks deep in the forest. And mycelia communicate in much the same way that humans communicate. Fascinating stuff. So the funguses are extremely important, and yet we spray them when we see a fungus in our lawn. Get out the pesticides, get out the chemicals. When I see a fungus in the lawn, I'm like, go fungus. So recap on pesticides. Not all have been tested for human safety. We use 70 million pounds of pesticides on lawns every year in the United States. That's 4 times more pesticides than are used on our farmlands. Of the most commonly used lawn pesticides, 13 can cause cancer, 14 can cause birth defects, 11 can interfere with reproduction, and 21 can damage the nervous system. That's according to the EPA. I went to the EPA's website because that word "can" was bothering me, and I looked at their chart. They have a chart, categories 1 through 5. 1 probably doesn't cause cancer, 5 definitely causes cancer. And these lawn pesticides were in the 4th column. That means they're like almost certain that they can cause cancer, and yet we're spraying them on our lawns. Pesticides have been linked to Parkinson's disease, brain cancer, endocrine and nervous system disruption, birth defects, developmental disorders, including the autistic spectrum, and childhood cancers and cat and dog cancers. Children and animals are much more susceptible to pesticide poisoning because they get right on the ground, they put their hands in their mouth, and when pesticides are outside, the sunlight eventually breaks them down. But once they're tracked inside on our shoes, they're going to stay there for a very long time. And children and animals are very often on the floor. According to the environmental health, children in whose homes pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides are sprayed are twice as likely to develop brain cancer. Pesticides also destroy species diversity and create monocultures. The Audubon Society estimates that 67 million birds are killed every year from pesticides. If your lawnmower is older than 3 years old, then 1 hour of power mowing is equivalent in air pollution as driving 350 miles by car. It's shocking, but true. They just instituted new regulations in 2011 that make it a little bit better, but still the lawnmower is more polluting than an automobile. More than 800 million gallons of gasoline are used every year to power lawn mowing equipment, and we spill 17 million gallons while refueling. That's more than was spilled in the Gulf of Alaska by the Exxon Valdez. We use 3 million tons of fertilizer on lawns every year, and the production, transportation, and application of fertilizers generates another 405 pounds of carbon dioxide. That's driving another 400 miles by car. 60% of the nitrogen applied to lawns ends up in our groundwater, and nitrogen is toxic to humans. There are actually dead zones all over the world where nothing is alive in the water because of the nitrogen in the water. So some communities around the world are banning the use of both lawn fertilizers and gas-powered lawnmowers in a last-ditch effort to try to save their waterways. Dead zones, however, are doubling every decade around the world. And water is a hot topic all over the world. 90% of the water on Earth is salt, and out of the 3 remaining percent, 2 are polluted. That leaves only 1% of the water on Earth for us and all the wildlife. And yet, lawns are the nation's largest irrigated crop, more than food, more than farm. In East Coast areas, we use 30% of the water on lawns, and nationwide, we use 50 to 70% of residential water on lawns. Waste, noise. We spend $40 billion on lawns every year. So I get the question all the time about, don't children need lawns? I don't think so. I know they need to run and play games, and athletic fields are wonderful, But nature is much more fascinating and limitless than even a toy. I've heard someone say that when a child plays with a toy, the child's play is limited by the mind that created that toy. But nature is limitless and fascinating. There are insects and wishes to be made and seeds to blow, logs to turn over, many shapes of rocks. There's moss to feel and surprises to discover, fragrance, things unfurling and unfolding, and things opening, and things reaching. There are shapes, stars, interesting shapes, beautiful colors, stripes, textures, and things to eat, bugs, beautiful bugs. There are animals, insects actually, that sleep inside flowers. And kids have their own sense of adventure, and the more nature there is around them, the more adventurous they are. Kids like to nurture nature and harvest their own food that they've grown themselves. And this I love. These are two kids who visited my property. And you can see that the boy is a little afraid to begin with, and his sister's helping him climb the tree. And then the more he goes, the more confident he becomes. Now he's strong, and now look at him, just from climbing a tree. So, I'm going to sum up about the lawns. But I wanted to point out, this was in some magazine, what's in and what's out. And you'll notice lawns are out. This was years ago, too. Now, they say to take the lawn out and replace it with stone. I'm not purporting that, of course. I'm saying take the lawn out and revegetate it with native plants. But it raises the question, like, why do we have lawns? And I read a book called The History of the Lawn. And humans were afraid of the plague, so it was a man against nature thing. And there were a few other reasons: fear of other men, marauding other invaders. But the one that I found the most interesting was in Europe, the people with the most livestock had their vegetation eaten down right to the ground. And so the people with the livestock were the wealthiest people. So the vegetation being down to the ground became the look of wealth. And that's how the lawn became a status symbol. And it's still a status symbol today. In 1948, there was a psychologist that said, intense care of the lawn is an excellent resolution to the tension created by too much free time. And that's why Americans spend so much time in their lawns. Well, I don't know about you. That was 1948. I don't have time. I don't have extra time. I'd gladly give that up. There are over 31,000 square miles of lawn in the United States. That's over 31 million acres. That's the same area as Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Jersey combined. And when I drive around, the only people I see on the lawns are the ones who are raking and mowing and fertilizing and watering. I very rarely see people out actually enjoying the lawn. So I'm going to put the lawn thing aside. A few more things that my company and I do not do is we don't deadhead, because before the advent of commercial bird seeds, birds ate the seeds and the fruits of native plants. In fact, commercial bird seed contains non-native invasive plant seeds. So plant native flowers, shrubs, and grasses instead. And plus, seeds are gorgeous. They're amazing, they're varied, they provide food for a lot of creatures, and even through the winter they hold and provide food. They give us volunteer plants. This is a native milkweed beetle, and they eat seeds. They eat the seeds of the Asclepias, so insects are dependent on seeds also. And if you have too many seeds, share them. Also, if you don't deadhead your plants, you leave the stalks, and beneficial insects overwinter in stalks. So another thing we don't do is rake leaves. I haven't raked leaves for probably 35 years also. I love leaves. And obviously this isn't my yard, but would you go in here and rake the leaves? No, I just love the leaves. And leaves are an extremely important part of the ecosystem. The soil food web has millions of organisms. In fact, if you have a handful of soil, you have more life forms in your hand than there are human beings on the planet. And that whole soil food web starts in the leaf litter, where worms and beetles eat out the middle of the leaves, and you see those veinated leaves on the ground. And then what they excrete goes to the lesser soil food web, and it goes down and down through the whole soil food web until your land is fertile. So the fertility of your soil starts in the leaf litter. Leaves insulate plants in winter, they reduce soil erosion, and they retain moisture in the soil in times of drought. And a lot of people, in my experience, don't like oak leaves because the oaks hold their leaves all winter. But I love the way they catch the snow, and then when the wind blows, it's music to me. And here's a good reason why we need leaves, because animals require leaves in order to live in. This is an eastern box turtle. When I was growing up, they were everywhere, and now they're endangered, in large part because we're raking up our leaves. That's where they live. That's why they look like that. That's their camouflage, and they need leaf litter in order to survive. Same with toads. And this is a butterfly chrysalis on the bottom of the leaves, so why would I rake that away? And many animals forage for their food under the leaves, birds being one of them. Hawks, owls depend on hearing things under the leaves so that they can target their prey. And animals use leaves and twigs and all the things we rake away and send to the dumps. They use them to build their nests and their homes. And this rare plant, the peace pipe, is dependent on leaf litter in order to survive. One leaf blower can produce as much pollution as 80 cars over 1 year, and they spread dust, dirt, animal droppings, and pesticides into the air, onto cars, and into open windows. So I love dead trees. We don't remove dead trees either unless they're in imminent danger. I'm just wild about dead trees. They're called snags, or either wildlife trees. With the exception of living plants, no other single component of the woodland environment supports as much animal and insect life as a dead tree. In North America, 85 species of birds, 50 mammals, and roughly a dozen species of reptiles rely on dead or partially dead trees for shelter, food, mating, resting, nesting, and other critical life-supporting functions. Dozens of invertebrates, including millipedes, beetles, sparrows, spiders, worms, ants, and more, also live in dead trees. And these insects are food for other animal life. According to the U.S. Forest Service, more than 1,200 forms of fauna rely on dead, dying, or rotting trees. And my favorite part of them is that they're gorgeous. This is a tree in a park in Riverhead that I actually would go hiking just to visit this dead tree. I love it. It's beautiful and architectural. That one as well. That one's upstate somewhere. I had to jump out of the car and photograph that. It's like a piece of sculpture. Absolutely gorgeous. But by far the greatest benefit of dead trees is the holes and cavities used for shelters and nests. Bats and snakes live in them. Tree frogs live in the bark of dead trees. Raccoons, squirrels, and opossum find their home there. Woodpeckers, nuthatches, wrens, chickadees, bluebirds, and tree swallows colonize dead trees. There's 13 holes in that dead tree. Short-eared owls dwell in trees. Screech owls dwell in trees. And these are here on Long Island. And dead trees, the way they fall can be beautiful, just like sculpture. Fox build their dens under fallen trees while they're still being held up by the branch stubs. And when they fall to the ground, salamanders, worms, and mice take up residence. Over time, decomposing logs release their nutrients and become nurse logs, providing a rich growing medium for tiny plants, including new tree seedlings. You can also grow vines up dead tree snags. This is a native Parthenocissus. And if you have to cut down a tree, make a wood pile. This is great habitat for turtles, chipmunks, snakes. So this is a lettuce plant that I could have thrown out, but I put it out in my grassy front yard for any animal to eat. Dalai Lama said that compassion is the new radicalism of our time. Compassion is radical. So compassionate landscaping we can undertake. It means less fertilizer, less pesticides. In fact, not defining so many things as pests, less water, less habitat destruction, less deadheading, less raking. Sounds great, doesn't it? Thoreau said, what good is a beautiful house if you don't have a planet to put it on? And I say, what good is the ecosystem if we don't have an ecosystem? So there's a lot of work to do. I know our lawn industry is a thriving industry. So if we're not going to do lawns, or if we're reducing lawn size, what do we do? There's still a lot of money to be made and a lot of work to be done in non-native invasive plant removal, vegetable gardens, birdscaping, insectscaping, lawn reclamation, and revegetating with native plants. This is a neighborhood in North Haven where non-native invasive was allowed to roam, and it has destroyed a huge section of the neighborhood. This is right in Southampton, a vacant lot where you can see Russian olives, but also miscanthus. I think that before long, miscanthus is going to be on the no-sell list, because all of those beautiful feathers that we've come to love so much are seeds, and they're turning up all over the place, deep in wooded sections and parks on Long Island. We can plant for bees and other pollinators. Always have something in bloom, always have different shapes and different colors. Native plants are best. They really prefer native plants. And I was looking into the whole bee colony collapse disorder thing, and realized that honeybees, the ones that are having this collapse, they're supplementing our native pollinators. So the question is, what has happened to our native pollinators? Why do we need to supplement them? Pesticides is what has happened. Reduce pesticides, and our native pollinators can recover. You can have a butterfly garden. This is a butterfly garden that we installed in North Haven. And I swear to you, when you're approaching this house, you see the butterflies coming from all around over to this place. And it's so beautiful to have the butterflies floating and lilting and all around you. Bird features, bird baths, bird houses can be beautiful. And this is a dead tree that we actually brought to this garden and planted in it, and birds visit it all the time. It's right outside this woman's window where she sits, so she's always seeing birds come to harvest the insect out of this piece of wood. Of course, plant for the birds, viburnums, elderberries. Mahoney is a great plant to attract birds. Juniper virginiana, of course. It looks like my trees are dancing when these berries are ready on the junipers. The robins love them. Any fruit tree, even shrub roses are edible to birds. These are rose hips. And of course, to attract hummingbirds, red tubular flowers. This is fuchsia and agastache and kufia and salvia. Another thing we do is we designate no-mow sections in people's yards. These white flags are designating the places where mowers are no longer allowed, and we see the native plants come back to life. And I don't have any other after pictures other than this, but you can see what a beautiful What a beautiful effect no mowing can have. These are other properties where the mowing has stopped and the natives come back to life. So native plants require less water and fertilizer because they're custom made for the environment to which they're native. They're less costly because we don't have to water them, spray them, fertilize them, dote over them. They have natural defenses against the other pests and fungi and diseases in the area. They've co-evolved with native creatures. They're important food sources, and the insects and animals disperse their seeds and stimulate plant growth. And here's, the New York Times said that native plants are the avant-garde in landscaping. So if you want to be the coolest kid on the block and a role model for everyone, use native plants. So this is the Old Town Meadow. It's in Southampton, right behind the hospital. It took me almost 3 years to complete this project. And 90% of the plants in this meadow are native. There were some plants that the owner just had to have, and there were other plants that we used that were non-native because we know they're beneficial to bees and to songbirds and other insects. But most of the plants in this meadow are native, and it's real important to know your native plants. Whenever I see native on the label, I buy the plant and then I go home and I research it. And I found a plant that had native on the label and brought it home to find out that it was native to Japan. So native can have, just like all natural, it can have a really broad definition, but a really great website for researching native plants is USDA. They give you a distribution map, and then right under the map you can click on a button that says View Native Status, and they'll give you a map to where it's native. So there is native to the United States, there's native to the west, native to the east, north, south. For this meadow, we use northeast native plants. And it's just breathtakingly beautiful. One of my favorite days working here, well, weeks I should say, the place was swarming with mosquitoes. It was unbearable. We could hardly work. And the very next day, when I came to work, there were thousands of dragonflies. Dragonflies can eat thousands of mosquitoes in a single day. And it was obvious, this meadow is surrounded by road on 3 sides, and it was obvious that the dragonflies were there just for the meadow because they get to the road and turn around and get to the other road and turn around. And they were just there to eat the mosquitoes. A few weeks later, the mosquitoes were back. And the very next day after that, there were swallows. And swallows also eat mosquitoes. And because we're not spraying and giving all this artificial stuff there, those animals were comfortable there. And the swallows, the same thing. They were just there for the meadow. They'd get to the road and turn back, and there were swallows everywhere. It was paradise. It was heaven, and there were no more mosquitoes. So just some shots of the meadow. And we don't deadhead in the fall. And if you walk through there at around this time where all the seeds are ripening, you'll see birds. You'll be flushing birds. And they're there for the seeds. So just a few of the plants. This is Verbena hostata. Agastache, this is not a native, but it's so, Agastache is one of the best plants for bees. They simply can't resist it. They're all over it. This is native Heliopsis, Helianthoides. This is Asclepias. Now the next few plants are what you should plant to encourage the monarchs to come back. These are the milkweeds, Asclepias incarnata, Asclepias tuberose. This is Asclepias ice ballet. And this is all the Asclepias photos I have, but there are about 10 to 12 varieties of Asclepias that are native to this area. So I encourage you to seek them out and plant them. Echinacea is native, Monarda dodema, this is Jacob Glein, this is Monarda fistulosa. There are other varieties of Monarda that are native also. Lobelia cardinalis is native and attracts all kinds of insects and hummingbirds. Spigelia marilandica, this one likes a little bit of shade, but it's native, it's gorgeous. Aguilegia canadensis is native. This is Limonium carolinianum and Liatris. Novae Angliae scariosa, also native. Mertensia is native. There are so many asters that are native, probably 30 species that are native to this area. This is one of them, Aster umbulatus, with Solidago and Vernonia in the background. Thermopsis caroliniana is native. Lupin perennis is native. Penstemon barbatus, Baptisia australis. A lot of the phloxes are native. This is Vernonia, there it is again. Solidago, several varieties that are native. This is one of my favorite natives, Pycnanthemum mudicum. This is a roiling, broiling soup of pollinators in the summertime. It is just amazing, and it's called mountain mint. It actually is minty. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, and the color is a great backdrop and foil for other flowers. Hardyageratum is native, Eupatorium coelestinium. And what's great about this is it blooms long after everything else is done, and it volunteers all over the garden, and it's one of my favorite plants. Physostegia virginiana, Veronicastrum virginicum, and the roseum. Now, this is another section of the Old Town property where they've just let it go natural, and I was out here walking around one day to see what I could find, and I came across this plant, Chamacrista fasciculata. This is a rare native plant, and I went back and harvested the seeds and gave them to Jim Glover, and now Jim Glover is selling Long Island genotype Chamacrista fasciculata that came from that field at Old Town. I also found hemp dogbane there, and this is a rare plant, but it's also in the milkweed family, and it's a larval source for monarch butterflies. And the next few slides are plants that I found growing on other properties that I've been called to consult or to landscape. And they were just there naturally, and I'm so glad we found them before they were killed to put in a lawn. So this is Myanthemum, this is Trailing arbutus, this is Chimophylla, this is Solidago flexicalis, and even Trillium I found on one property. Amazing. Unfortunately, it was killed by the Hurricane Sandy. So this is getting back to plants that we used in the meadow. This is Clethra alnifolia, native, fragrant, attracts hummingbirds. Aronia, there are a few varieties of Aronia that are native. Bayberry, Ilex glabra, Baccharis, Ilex verticillata. There are elderberries that are native. Viburnums, a lot of viburnums are native. High bush and low bush blueberry are native. There are rubus that are native. Native vines include Parthenocissus, which has berries when it gets mature. This is a great Apios americana. It's called American groundnut. It has this amazing flower and edible tubers. And my favorite native vine is Lonicera sempervirens. It's a nectar source for hummingbirds, bees, a nectar source and a larval host for butterflies. And it's beautiful, so choose it instead of clematis. It's much more useful for the insects. And the fruits attract quail, purple finches, goldfinch, and American robins. Native trees include Juniperus virginiana, Ilex opaca, Pinus rigida. That's Amelanchier in the back. It's a great architectural tree. Sassafras, pussy willow, sumac, which has this gorgeous seed head and beautiful fall color. But my favorite native tree by far is Prunus serratina, and in the trade they're often called trash trees. But this architectural, this is the tree that the kids were climbing up in my yard. It's the predominant tree in my yard. And that, the slide on top is a tree growing in a field in Montauk. So you can see it's a beautiful tree. It's fun to climb, and it's architectural. It has fragrant flowers in the springtime and gorgeous berries, which attract almost every kind of bird in our area, and gorgeous fall color. So they're not often available for sale in the trade because as soon as they germinate, they send down a long taproot. But more and more in recent years, I'm seeing them for sale. So if you can pick some up, do so. So in closing, what if we do all of this and we create a better world for nothing? Problem. So I'm not condemning anyone here who has a lawn or who sprays pesticides, or I'm sure you didn't have any of this information before. So I just want to give you the information, and you can make your own choices. The great aim of education is not knowledge, but action. And this is presumably one of our presidents. Don't talk to me about what's happening to the planet. It's America, not some planet. Well, don't talk to me about what's happening to the environment. This is my yard, not some environment. The Holy Land is everywhere. Everywhere on earth is holy and important. And this is something that everyone can do. You don't have to write away, you don't have to go to meetings, you don't have to protest. You can just stop mowing parts of your lawn. There are over 70 million acres of turf grass in the United States. If you can't feed 100 people, feed just one. I think Mother Teresa said that. If you can't save 70 million acres, you can save maybe a half acre or an eighth of an acre or a 16th of an acre. If everyone saved 1/70th of their turf and gave it back to nature, 1 million acres would be saved just like that and given back to all of our native creatures. I love this quote. Individual advances turn into social change when enough of them occur. That's powerful. If each one of us do this, we can start a revolution and our gardens can save the world. Thank you.